Greetings, friends, and welcome to this special presentation on the secret destiny of America. I want to begin by pointing out, for those that read my last book, The Messenger, you may immediately have a hint as to what's behind the unusual title of my upcoming book, part of which this presentation is based. The book is titled Zeitgeist 2025. Now, if you don't understand the connection, then I highly recommend you read The Messenger, as it's filled with the most incredible discoveries involving how, exactly 3.5 years before the original date set by NASA for the asteroid Apophis, which I argue is biblical wormwood at the middle of what most evangelicals and some Catholics call the 7-year Great Tribulation period, to come crashing down on this planet, April 13, 2029. The high holy days of the Feast of Tabernacles will be unfolding on Earth. Just a few days before that will be the Feast of Trumpets. And 120 days earlier, which is the biblical numerology for the end of mankind, is Pentecost. Now, all three of these festivals are strongly tied by eschatologists to the second coming of Jesus Christ. But before I get to how America's secret destiny is tied to the year 2025 and the prophecy of wormwood or Apophis, you may have seen recently where NASA is calling an all clear on the impact possibility of Apophis for the year 2029. But what they're not telling you is that a number of celebrated scientists disagree. For example, one mathematician is warning that NASA's trajectory calculation of Apophis is off by as much as 600,000 miles, which Harry Lear implies could send Apophis crashing into Earth 8 years from now on April 13, 2029. Lear even sent an open letter to the President of the United States and U.S. government scientists, begging them to cross-check these calculations from NASA immediately, even though he ends his dispatch with an ominous admonition that we're probably already out of time. More impressive than Lear, top 100 scientist Nathan Myhrvold, in a recent peer-reviewed paper titled An Empirical Examination of Wise Neowise Asteroid Analysis and Results, refutes much of the data from NASA, and he actually charges them with deliberately misreporting threats by near-Earth objects and even of behaving, quote, extremely deceptively with deliberate scientific misconduct in a cover-up of very real and potentially imminent space threats. And then there is famous planetary scientist and astrophysicist Neil deGrasse Tyson, who admits that on April 13, 2029, quote, Apophis will come so close to Earth that it'll dip below our orbiting communication satellites. It will be the largest, closest thing we have ever observed to come by Earth. The orbit we now have for it is uncertain. Pay attention to that. Because, he says, these things are hard to measure and hard to get an exact distance for, and, quote, we cannot tell you exactly where that trajectory will be, end quote. Now that list goes on, and it connects to other important information that I examine in the groundbreaking new book, Zeitgeist 2025, concerning why I believe that mankind has indeed, most likely, entered the last decade of history as it has been known, what prophecy teachers call the church age, and how the several unusual things that you're going to learn in that book set that work apart from all other books on prophecy. Now, among the amazing things that you're going to discover within those pages is how the Essenes of Dead Sea Scrolls fame were one of the ancient prophecy communities that predicted over 2,000 years ago that mankind would indeed enter its final age or Jubilee cycle 4 years from now in 2025, 3.5 years before Apophis smashes into our world. Assuming for the moment that I'm right, and that the asteroid Apophis is biblical wormwood, and therefore 2029 represents a period around the middle of the Great Tribulation period when the trumpet judgments began. Monday, October 13, 2025, that is April 13, 2029 minus 3.5 years, that would be the approximate start date for what dispensationalists call the 7 years of tribulation foreseen in the Bible in such places as Matthew 24, Revelation 7, Daniel 12, and so on. But besides prophecy, 2025 is intriguing in that it's also the year envisioned 10 years ago in a series of studies co-organized by the Atlantic Council and government organizations from Europe, the United States, Beijing, Tokyo, Dubai, other partnering nations that led the United States National Intelligence Council and the European Institute of Security Studies to produce a report that I encourage you to read titled Global Governance 2025 at a Critical Juncture. And in that document, the highest level intelligence agencies in the world determined that a global government could emerge around 2025 from what they called an unprecedented threat that would materialize, requiring all nations to lay down their differences and to come together in mutual defense of one another against an unprecedented menace. Among some of the things that they foresaw included knowledge of an incoming asteroid, a new pandemic, which I happen to believe Apophis is also bringing with it via an extremophile microorganism that has a virus inside of it. They also foresaw biotech-created new forms of humanity representing an existential threat. Other prescient secular research that focused on the year 2025 from times past includes a 1997 work by Professors William Strauss and Neil Howe titled The Fourth Turning, which examines Western historical paradigms over the past 5 centuries, and they discovered cycles of life and generational archetypes that expose an astoundingly revealing pattern of incidents which ultimately lead to chaos and what they called a fourth turning, which they, by the way, envisioned culminating in a totalitarian world government that they saw arriving, yes, around the year 2025. Now, the risk of such sacrificed civil liberties, like they imagined, under government authoritarianism. This was, of course, also foreseen by the brilliant English novelist George Orwell, who had endured the heartache, delusion, fears, and cultural shocks of the pre- and post-World War II Britain, in which he portrayed the ultimate goals of such totalitarianism and total government surveillance through his novels called 1984 and another novel called Animal Farm. Orwell died in January of 1950, long before the actual emergence of the very society that he feared was coming, a world of mechanized eyes and software slogans, a realm of meme speak and thought police as prophesied in his dystopian 1984 and in the fictional setting of Oceania, which depicted the era that we have now entered, and the 4 ministries, as he called them, that he envisioned under the figurehead of Big Brother: love, peace, plenty, and truth. The ministry of peace actually perpetrated unending wars. The ministry of love oversaw suffering and torture against those that would not adhere to the party line. The Ministry of Plenty weaponized starvation through socialism. And then there was the Ministry of Truth, the propaganda arm of the government media that employed fake news, doublethink, and newspeak as the official dialectic of the state. Newspeak is the term that Orwell invented for controlled language, restricted grammar, and limited vocabulary, as what he called a linguistic design meant to limit the freedom of thought, personal identity, self-expression, free will, that ideologically threatened the regime of Big Brother and the party, who therefore criminalized such concepts as thought crimes, contradictions of the English Socialist Party orthodoxy. Now, as might be already going through your mind, today in America, the nonfiction version of the Ministry of Truth has materialized, and it is fully operational through the Orwellian tools of modern Marxists and social media manipulators, including so-called news organizations that blacklist Christian and conservative commentary by burying search results and exhibiting other bias in their artificial intelligence shadow banning algorithms, and so on. Orwell actually foresaw this very society where social media and 24-hour news cycles invigorate a cancel culture mob into tyrannizing anyone who holds what they consider to be the wrong opinions, or say the wrong words, or point out the dangers of progressive ideologies' new truths.
I want to start with North Carolina, where a conservative student was actually spray painted in the face.
We were accosted by a few members of the YDSA club here. They're merely expressing our free speech, and these people rolled up in a concerted, intentional attempt, pre-planned attempt to censor our speech.
Let's head now to one of the most egregious examples of conservatives being targeted and physically attacked for their beliefs. Back in February, a recruiter was harassed and punched in the face at UC Berkeley. Watch this.
This case has basically gone cold. He pleaded guilty. The DA is still sitting on it, no trial. If you do physical violence against conservatives, such as a professor who smacked someone with a bike lock not too long ago, you might get away with it.
That's what's happening right now. The most vivid recent example being the burning down of all things Donald Trump, his brand, anything or anybody that appeared to support him. Now, in Strauss and Howe's The Fourth Turning vision, a deal with the devil ultimately includes the arrival of an unexpected national leader who would emerge during the current fourth turning. Now, this guy would come from an older generation, and he would lead the globe into a new world order, which they envisioned developing by the year 2025. This senior citizen, this oldest American president, this commander, whom they called the Gray Champion, and who some of us might worry could either be, or more likely pave the way for, Antichrist, would come to power as a result of the nation losing faith in existing government and desperate for a political savior to arrive and calm nerves by offering to build back better a socialist governance with welfare for the masses. This leadership, they saw, would seize what could only be described as a cancel culture crusade, warm to promulgating Oceania-like suppression of unapproved dialogue in order to rein in any and all challenges to the new social construct. Is it real? Just ask the MyPillow guy. or Mandalorian star Gina Carano, or conservative actor and pro-life advocate Kevin Sorbo, or alt-tech microblogging and social networking service Parler. If you challenge today's official narratives as handed down by America's militant left, it's a very good way to get deplatformed, shadow banned, publicly scorned, or worse, under the new Oceania rules. At Skywatch TV, we're all too familiar with this shadow banning of our reports, getting kicked off of our newsletter email service for conservative Christian commentary, and of course I myself, once more being mislabeled by Professor S. Jonathan O'Donnell, the fellow in the Clinton Institute for American Studies that a few years back referred to me as Horns Milieu as the leader of the transhumanist agenda. But he's now referred to me again in another peer-reviewed journal, Religion, as a, quote, Christian nationalist, end quote, which USA Today calls, quote, a threat embedded throughout our governing institutions, courts, military, legislature, agencies, and police, end quote, which I certainly am not, as anybody who has read my warnings against dominionism could attest. I am a patriotic American. I love this nation, and I vote. But first and foremost, I'm a born-again believer, committed to advancing the gospel of the kingdom of God over any other kind of nationalism. It would just really be so nice, wouldn't it, if people would just read the Federalist Papers, including the 10th one, in which Madison argues that faction is what motivates Americans, meaning that our strength lies in passions and opinions on different things, and it is, or should be, our ability to learn from one another and compromise or peacefully disagree that lies at the foundations of greater resolution and civility, the bedrock of what made America great. But it seems political commentator Dennis Prager may have been correct when at the time he was watching unfolding events at the close of 2020, including the subsequent actions by big tech to censor commentary from a sitting president, he said,
"This is the Reichstag fire relived. 1933, a month after the Nazis took over, the German parliament was burned down. It didn't matter to the Nazis who did it. What mattered was what they could use it for, and they used it for the Enabling Act that they quickly rammed through Parliament, and it enabled the Nazis to curtail civil liberties in the name of a national emergency caused by the burning of the Parliament, of the Reichstag."
This is the Reichstag fire relived. We're living in a gigantic lie that is reminiscent of the Reichstag fire. Now, if you don't know what Prager was talking about, the Reichstag fire was an arson attack on the Reichstag building, home of the German parliament in Berlin, on Monday, 27 February 1933, precisely 4 weeks after Adolf Hitler was sworn in as Chancellor of Germany. Hitler's government stated that Marinus von der Lubbe, a Dutch council communist, was the culprit, and it attributed the fire to communist agitators. A German court decided later that year that Lubbe had acted alone, as he had claimed. The day after the fire, though, the Reichstag fire decree was passed. The Nazi Party used the fire as a pretext to claim that communists were plotting against the German government, which made the fire pivotal in the establishment of Nazi Germany. So the Nazis capitalized on the fire, and they quickly moved with a vengeance to cement their authority and to grant the state unprecedented power, of course in the name of public safety, you know. That resulted in suspending most civil liberties in Germany, including habeas corpus, freedom of expression, freedom of the press, the right of free association and public assembly, and the secrecy of the post and telephone. These rights were not reinstated during Nazi reign. The decree was used by the Nazis to ban publications not considered friendly to the Nazi cause, with communist electoral participation also suppressed. The communists previously had polled at 17% of the vote. The Nazis now were able to increase their share of the vote in the March 5, 1933 Reichstag election from 33 to 44%, and that gave the Nazis and their allies, the German Nationalist People's Party, who won 8% of the vote, a majority of 52% in the Reichstag. Now, Strauss and Howe were convinced 25 years ago that something very similar was going to unfold in the years immediately before Zeitgeist 2025, when they wrote their thesis. They saw the United States in the third turning then, and that the next crisis period, or fourth turning, would erupt around 2025, which I contend, again, is more likely than not to represent the start of what dispensationalist Christians call the Great Tribulation period. Will the suppression of free speech under the new administration's tech oligarchy and the Soros and Obama-backed agitators that have continued to threaten havoc across America, will that ignite the circumstances that assist the gray champion's authoritarian rule? America has experienced three such major crises before: the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, and the Great Depression and World War II, each of which were followed by their respective periods of Reconstruction. These were times marked by social decay and civil dread that required Americans to carry a tremendous burden after massive conflict and substantial loss in order to try and rebuild a better future. And don't forget, it was Barack Obama who, after designating America no longer a Christian nation, declared just days before his election in 2008, quote, "We are 5 days away from fundamentally transforming the United States of America," end quote. His wife, Michelle Obama, echoed those sentiments earlier, saying, "We're going to have to change our traditions, our history. We're going to have to move into a different place as a nation," end quote. This intentional redefining of the nation and attempt at changing the course of the United States was partly what Donald Trump was trying to stop, and why in his State of the Union address in February 2019, he declared that as long as he was president, America would never be a socialist country.
Here in the United States, we are alarmed by the new calls to adopt socialism in our country. America was founded on liberty and independence, and not government coercion, domination, and control. We are born free, and we will stay free. Tonight, we renew our resolve that America will never be a socialist country.
Did all that change January 20, 2021, with the inauguration of Joe Biden? As the oldest American president ever, is he Strauss and Howe's gray champion that's going to lead the world into a socialist, Marxist, totalitarian world government? According to the Christian End Times blog Signposts of the Time, quote, "We as Christians, and in particular those that understand and follow Bible prophecy, will be watching with much interest over the next days, weeks, and months ahead to see how God will use President Joe Biden to put in place the final pieces of the last days puzzle that will usher in the tribulation period and the system of Antichrist," end quote. Are they right? Are we nearing the trigger events or chaos stage of a final fourth turning? Besides professors of history, like those who wrote The Foreturning and who foresaw what the actions and reactions of policymakers and social engineers would generate, behind such political players and master manipulators at these cultural realms, there's a different thing that I want to talk about, and that's an invisible order, vividly described in Scripture, that I believe holds deeper insight in where we are today and the influences that are guiding us to where we're going next. And that's what I really want to discuss in this presentation. Before and after the presidency of Donald Trump, the United States was, and now is again, on an intentional trajectory to fulfill what famous Freemason Manly P. Hall described as the secret destiny of America, which includes future national and global subservience to a God, the God of Freemasonry, a deity that most Americans would never imagine when reciting the Pledge of Allegiance to, quote, one nation under God. In fact, the idea by some that the United States was established as a monotheistic Christian nation by those who designed Washington, D.C., and that the God referred to on American currency is a Judeo-Christian one is a puzzling conclusion when reflected against the secret society, mystery religion, and deistic beliefs of so many of the founding fathers, as is, of course, perpetually viewed in the supreme architect deism of Freemasons and in the supreme judge of the world and divine providence notations in the Declaration of Independence and the countless pagan icons that dominate the symbols, statues, buildings, and seals that are carefully drafted under official government auspices. In fact, the Great Seal of the United States, which Manly Hall rightly called the signature of that exalted body of Masons who designed America for a particular and peculiar purpose, he said, bears rich symbolism, forecasting anything but Christianity. In fact, when Christians in the 1800s argued that a hypothetical annihilation of the United States would ultimately lead to antiquaries of succeeding centuries, that is, historians, concluding that America had been a heathen nation based on symbolism of the Great Seal, Congress was pushed to create something reflecting the Christian faith of so many of its citizens. U.S. President and Freemason Theodore Roosevelt strongly opposed that idea, but other Masons were not as frustrated with the plan because, given the ambivalence of the term God and the axiom that, interpreted within the context of the Great Seal symbolism and the layout of Washington, D.C., this would certainly not infer a biblical Christian God. The slogan, "In God We Trust," therefore, whoever you believe that to be, was accommodated by Masons and other Illuminati, and so approved as the official U.S. motto. Now, in several of my books, including Zenith 2016, which, by the way, noted years in advance the date of Trump's presidential election as having been foreseen by prophets and sages for thousands of years as the apex date when governments would begin shifting toward the spirit predicted on the Great Seal of the United States, the Antichrist, followed by the man of sin's actual arrival and acceptance on the global stage. Will that be 2025? To illustrate the point that one definitely would not determine the God in America's official motto refers to the Father of Jesus Christ or a biblical Trinity, in Zenith 2016 I wrote this. Quote, imagine yourself as a space traveler who visits Earth in a fictional post-apocalyptic world, digging through the rubble of the once thriving planet. You come across a copy of a U.S. $1 bill with the two-sided Great Seal of the United States, joined in the middle by the phrase, "In God We Trust." Upon consideration, you ask yourself, what God did this refer to? And with no preconceptions, you allow the symbolism on the seal to speak for itself, from which you quickly determine that this had been a great culture who worshipped Egyptian and Greek deities, especially a particular solar one whose all-seeing eye glared from atop an unfinished Egyptian pyramid. Upon further investigation into the specific beliefs of this strange group, whose members had influenced the Great Seal, you discover from their highest masters, including one illustrious Albert Pike, that the sun god they venerated so highly had been known to them at various times in history by the names Apollo, Osiris, and Nimrod. I made this argument in Zenith 2016 because, unknown to most Americans and certainly average Christians, the Great Seal's mottos and symbolism relate to both Osiris and Apollo specifically, yet as one. Osiris is the dominant theme of the Egyptian symbols, his resurrection and return, while the mottos of the seal point directly to Apollo, and the eagle, a pagan emblem of Jupiter, to Apollo's father. For instance, the motto Anuet Coeptus, this is taken from Virgil's Aeneid, in which Ascanius, the son of Aeneas, from conquered Troy, prays to Apollo's father, Jupiter. Charles Thompson, designer of the Great Seal's final version, condensed line 625 of Book 9 of Virgil's Aeneid, which reads, quote, Jupiter omnipotus, audacibus anuet coeptus, or all-powerful Jupiter, favors the daring undertaking. He condensed that down to anuet coeptus. Jupiter, or he, approves our undertaking. While the phrase Novus Ordo Seclorum, a new order of the ages, was adapted in 1782 from inspiration that Thompson found in a prophetic line in Virgil's Eclogue 4, Magnus ab integro seclorum nascitur ordo, the interpretation of that Latin being, and the majestic roll of circling centuries begins anew. This is a phrase that is from the Cumae Sibyl, a pagan prophetess of Apollo, actually the most famous of them all, identified in the Bible as a demonic deceiver, and it involves the future birth of a divine son, spawned of a new breed of men sent down from heaven, when he receives the life of gods and sees heroes with gods commingling. According to the prophecy, this is Apollo, son of Jupiter, who returns to Earth through mystical life given to him from the gods when the deity, Jupiter or Saturn, returns to reign over the Earth in a new golden pagan age. By the way, the alignment of Jupiter and Saturn on December 21, 2020, recently forecasted, which many, including pastors, were erroneously referring to as the Christmas star, which according to the Greek text, the Magi followed, an asteroid whose trajectory led them to Bethlehem, not a stationary star alignment like the Jupiter recent alignment. Anyway, this was the closest the two planets have appeared together in approximately 800 years, and it did indeed forecast the arrival of a messianic son, the false one, whose spirit will reside in the beast of Revelation 17:8. From the beginning of the prophecy, referenced on the Great Seal of the United States, we read, quote, Now the last age by Cumae Sibyl's sung has come and gone, and the majestic roll of circling centuries begins anew. Justice returns old Saturn or Jupiter's reign, with a new breed of men sent down from heaven. Only do thou at the boy's birth, in whom the iron age shall cease, the golden race arise. Befriend him, chaste Lucina, 'tis thine own Apollo reigns. He shall receive the life of gods and see heroes with gods commingling, and himself be seen of them, and with his father's worth reign over the world. Assume thy greatness, for the time draws nigh, dear child of gods, great progeny of Jupiter or Zeus. See how it totters, the world's orbed might, earth and wide ocean, and the vault profound. All see, enraptured, at the coming time, end quote. Now, according to Virgil and the Cumae Sibyl, whose prophecy formed the Novus Ordo Seclorum of the Great Seal of the United States, the New World Order is going to begin during a time of chaos, when the earth and oceans are tottering, a time like today. This is when the Son of Promise arrives on earth, Apollo incarnate, a pagan savior, born of a new breed of men sent down from heaven, when heroes and gods are blended together. It sounds eerily similar to what the Watchers did, doesn't it, during the creation of the Genesis 6 giants, and why many believe Antichrist also represents a return of the Nephilim. But to understand why such a fanciful prophecy about Apollo, son of Jupiter, returning to Earth should be important to you, in ancient literature, Jupiter was the Roman replacement of Yahweh as the greatest of the gods. He was a counter Yahweh. His son Apollo is a replacement of Jesus, a counter Messiah, a counter Jesus. This Apollo comes to rule when the final New World Order arrives, as justice returns old Saturn's reign. The ancient goddess Justice, who returns Saturn's reign, Saturnia Regna, the pagan golden age, was known to the Egyptians as Mat, and to the Greeks as Demas, while to the Romans she was Lustitia. Statues and reliefs of her abandon thousands of government buildings and courts around the world, but especially in Washington, D.C., as famous Lady Justice, as we call her, blindfolded and holding scales and a sword. She represents the enforcement of secular law and is, according to the Sibyl's conjure, the authority that's going to require global compliance to the zenith of Satan's dominion, concurrent with the coming of Apollo. What's more, the Bible's accuracy concerning this subject is alarming, including the idea that pagan justice is going to require surrender to a satanic system in a final world order under the rule of Jupiter's son. In the New Testament, the identity of the god Apollo, repeat-coded in the Great Seal of the United States as the Masonic Messiah who returns to rule the earth, is the same spirit, verified by the same name, that's going to inhabit the political leader of the end times New World Order. According to key Bible prophecies, the Antichrist will be the progeny or the incarnation of the ancient spirit of Apollo. 2 Thessalonians 2:3 says this, "Let no man deceive you by any means, for that day shall not come, except there come a falling away first, and the man of sin be revealed, the son of perdition." And the Greek word there, perdition, is Apollo, Apoleia. Revelation 17:8 likewise ties the coming of Antichrist with Apollo, revealing that the beast is going to ascend from the bottomless pit and enter into him. Here's what it says, quote, "The beast that thou sawest was and is not, and shall ascend out of the bottomless pit and go into perdition," Apoleia, Apollo. "And they that dwell on the earth shall wonder, whose names were not written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, when they behold the beast that was and is not and yet is." Among other things, friends, that means that the Great Seal of the United States is a prophecy hidden in plain sight by the Founding Fathers for more than 200 years, foretelling the return of a terrifying demonic God who seizes control of earth in the new order of the ages. This supernatural entity was known and feared in ancient times by different names: Apollo, Osiris, even further back, by the way, as Nimrod, whom the Masons consider to be the father of their institution. Here's the big question. Have modern leaders of the United States government acknowledged this secret destiny of America? Well, when U.S. Representative Nancy Pelosi on January 4, 2007 first assumed her role as Speaker of the House at the opening of the 110th Congress, something interesting happened. She followed the pattern set by George W. Bush and his old man, infusing a loaded statement concerning the Founding Fathers, saying they were so confident, quote, in the America they were advancing, they put on the seal, the Great Seal of the United States, Novus Ordo Seclorum, a new order for the centuries, end quote. Pelosi did not go into detail as to why she considered the phrase Novus Ordo Seclorum important dialectic during the momentous changeover of the control of Congress, and neither did she add why that expression exists beneath the unfinished pyramid and the all-seeing eye of Horus, Osiris, Apollo in the Great Seal of the United States in the first place. But her allusion to it was not coincidental. I believe it was framed against January 20, 2001, when her dynastic establishment pal, President George W. Bush, during his first inaugural address, faced the obelisk known as the Washington Monument, and he twice referred to an angel that rides in the whirlwind and directs this storm. Now, Bush's reference was credited to Virginia statesman John Page, who had written to Thomas Jefferson after the Declaration of Independence was signed and had said, quote, "We know the race is not to the swift nor the battle to the strong. Do you not think an angel rides in the whirlwind and directs this storm?" End quote. But just 5 weeks after Bush's inaugural, on Wednesday, February 28, 2001, Congressman Major R. Owens of New York stood before the House of Representatives, and he actually prayed to this angel in the whirlwind, asking the spiritual force to guide the future and the fate of the United States. 28 weeks later, for a total of 33 weeks from the day of the inaugural, a number invaluable to mysticism and occult fraternities, 19 Islamic terrorists attacked the United States, according to the official story, hijacking 4 commercial airliners and crashing 2 of them into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in New York City. They slammed a 3rd into the Pentagon, and a 4th, which had been directed towards Washington, D.C., crashed near Shanksville, Pennsylvania. But what happened that day resulted in nearly 3,000 immediate deaths, at least 24 missing persons, and the stage being set for changes to the existing world order. Following that, when Bush was giving his second inaugural speech 4 years later, he continued offering cryptic commentary, saying, quote, "For half a century, America defended our own freedom by standing watch on distant borders. After the shipwreck of communism came years of relative quiet, years of repose, years of sabbatical. And then there came a day of fire," end quote. A few paragraphs following, Bush continues to clarify where he's coming from by adding, quote, "By our efforts, we have lit a fire as well, a fire in the minds of men. It warms those who feel its power. It burns those who fight its progress. And one day, this untamed fire will reach the darkest corners of the world," end quote. Now, if you don't know this, that phrase, "a fire in the minds of men," is from Fyodor Dostoevsky's 19th century book, The Possessed, or The Devils. This was a novel that was set in pre-revolutionary Russia, where civil resistance is seen championed by nihilist Sergei Negov, who tries to ignite a revolution of such destructive power that society will be completely destroyed. Folks, the fact that a United States president would quote that phrase in an official speech of record was astonishing to many of us at the time, given that The Possessed, The Devils, is about violent government crackdown on dissent that sparks civil unrest and revolution marked by public violence, something eerily reminiscent of today. Fire in the Minds of Men is also the title that historian James H. Billington so famously chose for his book on the history of revolutions, including the origin of occult Freemasonry and its influence in the American Revolution. To make matters even more transparent to his secret society pals, in his closing comments, Bush himself tied the inaugural crypticisms to the Masonic involvement in the American Revolution, saying, quote, "When our founders declared a new order of the ages, they were acting on an ancient hope that is meant to be fulfilled," end quote. The phrase, "a new order of the ages," is taken, of course, from the Great Seal, Novus Ordo Seclorum. And Bush further acknowledged that the secret society members were acting on an ancient hope that is meant to be fulfilled. Now fast forward to today and the election of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris and the surreal, illicit invocation to dark supernaturalism tied to those governing entities, intent on fulfilling, as Bush prophesied, that ancient conspiracy from the Great Seal of the United States. Well, that plot's been immediately revived, right on cue. We watched as Democrat Representative Emanuel Cleaver offered up the congressional prayer opening up the 117th Congress in the name of, quote, "the monotheistic God Brahma, and God known by many names by many different faiths," end quote. Setting aside the numerous incorrect assumptions by Cleaver involving Brahma, the entreaty to such a Hindu god was actually highly appropriate. Why? Because Vice President Kamala Devi Harris, her name invokes deities from Hindu mythology, and not just any kind of generic deity, but illusionary and destructive ones. From the surprising meaning of Kamala Harris's name at thelist.com, you can read how, quote, "Kamala is another name of a well-known Hindu goddess who is probably better known as Lakshmi. Devi is a Hindu goddess as well. It is a Sanskrit word that means goddess, but it's also the name of the Hindu mother goddess. Devi is considered to encompass womanhood completely, but she does have a fierce side and is involved not only in creating worlds, but destroying them as well." Now, Kamala's sister's name matches hers. Maya's middle name is Lakshmi as well. Maya is also a Sanskrit name meaning illusion, and is another name of Durga, a Hindu goddess. Now, the list goes on to explain that Kamala's mother, Shamala, chose those names specifically because, quote, "a culture that worships goddesses produces strong women," end quote, she told the Los Angeles Times. Perhaps that explains why those strong women and men have taken to the streets of Portland, Oregon over the last 2 years to feed the spirit of chaos beneath the shadow of Portlandia. The second largest copper statue after the Statue of Liberty of a goddess in the United States at 34 feet, 10 inches tall and weighing 6.5 tons. If standing, she would tower at approximately 50 feet tall. The Portlandia statue is located above the entrance of the City of Portland office buildings. It's downtown, where much of the chaos has been playing out. It's implicative of the goddess of witchcraft, Hecate, supposedly designed after Lady Commerce on the Portland City Seal. Portlandia holds a trident, which is considered of the utmost importance for sorcery and indispensable to the efficacy of infernal rites. She holds that under a six-pointed star, also an important instrument of dark arts and Hecatean witchcraft. Now, as occultists know, the metal, copper, that Portlandia is crafted from was sacred to these ancient goddess worshippers. In early Rome, copper was called cyprium, due to it being primarily mined from Cyprus, the birthplace of the goddess Aphrodite. It was also sacred to the sun god of Babylon and similar deities, some of whom required human sacrifice. A plaque beneath Portlandia offers disquieting connections between her influence over that city and the souls of those citizens that she reigns over. Here's what it says, quote, "She kneels down and from the quietness of copper reaches out. We take that stillness into ourselves, and somewhere deep in the earth, our breath or souls become her city. If she could speak, this is what she would say. Follow that breath. Home is the journey we make. This is how the world knows where we are," end quote. Ladies and gentlemen, the pattern continues between some of America's recent national leaders, whose invitations, unlike Donald Trump's habitual recognition of the Judeo-Christian God of the Bible, have been to dark supernaturalism for ruling over and guiding the souls and destiny of the nation into an occult world order. This now includes the new vice president, who could certainly become the actual president if aging Joe Biden, who former White House stenographer Mike McCormick, who worked for Biden for the past 6 years, says has lost 50% or more of his cognitive abilities if he becomes incapacitated or otherwise incapable of fulfilling his 4-year term. And she, of course, again bears the name of Hindu entities connected with illusion and the destruction of worlds. But that said, Joe Biden's name is also intriguing. In fact, a Jewish scholar has pointed out that the Hebraic name for Joe Biden translates as, alas, judgment. And then there are other experts that note that his name beckons the arrival of a promised son, a Messiah, according to prominent Rabbi R.A. Weingarten, who says that Biden's name contains the letters which spell out the word for hand. Now, an article at Israel365.com explains the significance. Quote, Rabbi Weingarten states the first and last letters of Biden's name spell out the word ben, meaning son, which hints at the process of Messiah, which will come through Messiah ben David, the anointed son of David, and Messiah ben Joseph, the anointed son of Joseph. Rabbi Weingarten added that the gematria, Hebrew numerology, of Ben is 52, which equals the name of Elijah, the prophet, who is the harbinger of the Messiah. Rabbi Weingarten then noted the inner letters of the name Biden, Yud and Dalet. The gematria of those letters equals 24. Many times in the Bible, he says, David's name is written with Yud, bringing the numerical total of his name to 24. He then goes on to explain Biden's last name is coming to remind us that we are on the verge of Elijah's arrival to reestablish the Davidic dynasty. The problem is, of course, for Christians and Messianic Jews, the Messiah already arrived in the New Testament. His name is Jesus. Therefore, the prophetic suggestion involving Biden's name more likely indicates a role that he might play with the coming of the false Messiah, the Antichrist. And there are some Orthodox rabbis who seem to agree with that conclusion, connecting the election of Biden and Kamala with the return of the days of Noah. Rabbi Yoel Schwartz, the head of the Sanhedrin's Noahide court, a highly respected Torah law authority, actually produced a video in which he commented on the divergent possibilities of the U.S. presidential election. And one of the things that he made that I found interesting was where he found that the elections were held on the 17th of Shesvan. Schwartz noted that according to Jewish tradition, rains that caused the flood in the time of Noah began falling on that day. It was also on that day, he says, that here in Israel, the first rains of the season fell in earnest. They should have been rains of blessing, but since Biden was elected, these rains became like the rain of the same day in the time of Noah, a harbinger of a coming flood. He also says, quote, the Democrats are spreading the very same sins that forced Noah into the ark. While another rabbi similarly noted in Hebrew that Harris's name also means destruction. So, with Trump out of the way, at least for the time being, the dark side of the deep state is quickly reviving efforts to get America back on track to its secret destiny, summoning those agents of chaos whose ancient scheme is going to culminate in arrival of the dreaded man of sin. Joe Biden himself pledged allegiance to that New World Order in the Wall Street Journal op-ed, How I Learned to Love the New World Order, in which he detailed his vision of surrendering American sovereignty to a new global government via the United Nations. You can Google that and read it for yourself. Will Biden's vision quickly unfold in the countdown to Zeitgeist 2025? It appears that left-leaning Americans are certainly rushing to embrace that vision, and it brings me to the countdown to 2025, the prophecy on the Great Seal of the United States, and the secret destiny of America. Let me tell you a little story. Over a decade ago, on a business trip to Washington, D.C., my wife Nita and I, with help from a congressman at that time, were able to meet with two members of the Scottish Rite Freemasonry who had unrestricted access to all but the most secret and highest guarded documents of the order. We joined one of them at the House of the Temple, the headquarters of the Scottish Rite Freemasonry, Southern Jurisdiction, where the Rites Supreme Council, 33rd degree, have their meetings. And we met with the other one at the George Washington Masonic Memorial in Alexandria, Virginia. Both of these men were very helpful and informative, but they became evasive whenever I probed too deeply into certain areas. At the House of the Temple, like elsewhere, the Brotherhood of Darkness, as my old late friend Dr. Stanley Monteith used to call them, intentionally hide in plain sight their occult aspirations, which ultimately are going to be conceived in that one world order and one world religion under the son of Lucifer. Or, as Manly P. Hall put it, quote, "The outcome of the secret destiny is a world order ruled by a king with supernatural powers. This king was descended of a divine race. That is, he belonged to the order of the illumined. For those who come to a state of wisdom, then belong to a family of heroes, perfected human beings," end quote. And when Hall offered that astonishingly perceptive commentary about the future Masonic king who is descended of a divine race of illumined or Luciferic heroes, perfected, half-man, half-god human beings, he nailed exactly what the Watchers had done and what the Cumae Sibyl's Great Seal prophecy says is going to occur again with the second coming of Apollo, Osiris, Nimrod. Now, I cited the Cumae Sibyl's prophecy earlier, which Manly P. Hall noted is reflected in the, quote, "mass of occult and Masonic symbols," end quote, on the Great Seal, which he believed only students of archaic or esoteric symbolism would be able to accurately decipher. But after years of research and meeting with high-level Freemasons and others, I believe that I too can help with this enigma. And it requires that I back up a little bit and explain some history that you may have seen me discussing recently on Daystar Television, as well as you will see in an even more intense upcoming 6-week special series set to air on Skywatch TV throughout July and the beginning of August. That starts at the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And the authors of that historic document, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and Benjamin Franklin. Within one day of July 4, 1776, these three men were assigned the task of serving what today we would call a steering committee or a task force regarding the Great Seal's design. What should it ultimately communicate about the establishment of this nation, its objectives, its destiny? That's what Great Seals are supposed to do. First, consider that John Adams was an American president and a close friend of Thomas Jefferson. But Adams rejected the Christianity of his parents. In fact, he hated the doctrine of the Trinity. He hated the notion of the deity of Jesus and other foundational truths of Christianity that were being preached at that early time. But worse than Adams was the second member of the Great Seal Triad, Thomas Jefferson. Along with Thomas Paine, who also wrote that Jesus was a blasphemous fable and that the Bible was scarcely anything but a history of the grossest vices and a collection of the most paltry and contemptible tales, whose Almighty, he said, committed debauchery with a woman engaged to be married. And the belief of this debauchery is called faith, he said. Yeah, early founding fathers did give themselves to such astonishing blasphemy. Jefferson was among the worst. In fact, he said this about the book of Revelation in a letter to General Alexander Smith, dated January 17, 1825, quote, "It is between 50 and 60 years since I read it, and I then considered it merely the ravings of a maniac, no more worthy nor capable of explanation than the incoherences of our own nightly dreams," end quote. Through the rest of his letter, Jefferson made it clear to the general that he had not repented of his formerly held view, and he believed that the Chronicle of Jesus, as depicted in the Bible, was an unmitigated fraud. Here is what he said in another letter to William Short, dated October 31, 1819, quote, "The greatest of all the reformers of the depraved religion of his own country was Jesus of Nazareth, abstracting what is really his from the rubbish in which it is buried," talking about the Bible, "easily distinguished by its luster from the dross of his biographers, and as separable from that as the diamond from the dunghill," end quote. That passage describes the approach that Jefferson also took in writing his so-called Jefferson Bible. What he claimed he was attempting to do, and he wrote about extensively, in hacking the Bible into pieces and then taping it back together to form his own cursed version of Scripture, was to separate the true sayings of Jesus from the things he believed had been added to the gospel accounts. For example, in a letter to John Adams, he wrote, quote, "In the New Testament, there is internal evidence that parts of it have proceeded from an extraordinary man, and that other parts are of the fabric of very inferior minds. It is as easy to separate those parts as to pick out diamonds from dunghills," end quote. When one reads the Jefferson Bible, it becomes clear what Jefferson was referring to when he mentioned dunghills that needed to be removed from Scripture. He specifically took a pair of scissors and a razor blade, and he cut out evidence of the divinity of Jesus, of the messianic assignment of Jesus, including the virgin birth, the miracles of Christ, the Lord's resurrection, his ascension into heaven, and so on. And because it details his second coming and arrival of Antichrist, the entire book of Revelation was omitted. These were among the things Jefferson believed came from inferior minds, forming dunghills. Concerning the Lord Jesus himself, Jefferson wrote in another letter on April 13, 1920, quote, "Among the sayings and discourses imputed to him by his biographers," that is, the authors of the Bible, "I find many passages of fine imagination, correct morality, and of the most lovely benevolence, and others, again, of so much ignorance, so much absurdity, so much untruth, charlatanism, and imposture, that I separate, therefore, the gold from the dross, and leave the latter to the stupidity of some, and roguery of others of his disciples. Of this band of dupes and impostors, Paul," talking about the Apostle Paul, "was the first corrupter of the doctrines of Jesus," end quote. So that was the second member who would guide the design of the Great Seal of the United States. And then there was Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin was one of the most influential founding fathers. He was, without question, deeply involved in Freemasonry and in other secret societies. He belonged to secret groups in 3 countries involved in the War of Independence: America, France, and England. He was master of the Masonic Lodge of Philadelphia. While over in France, he was master of the Nine Sisters Lodge, from which sprang the French Revolution, which was significantly anti-God. In England, he joined a rockish political group founded by Sir Francis Dashwood, known as the Hellfire Club. This 18th century group is described as follows, quote, "The Hellfire Club was an exclusive English club that met sporadically during the mid-18th century. Its purpose, at best, was to mock traditional religion and to conduct orgies. At worst, it involved the indulgence of satanic rites and sacrifices. The club to which Franklin belonged was established by Francis Dashwood, a member of Parliament and friend of Franklin. The club, which consisted of the Superior Order of 12 members, took part in basic forms of satanic worship. In addition to taking part in the occult, orgies and parties with prostitutes were also said to be the norm," end quote. It might have been a lot darker than that. On February 11, 1998, the Sunday Times out of England reported that 10 bodies were dug up from beneath Benjamin Franklin's home at 36 Craven Street in London. The bodies were of 4 adults and 6 children. They were discovered during a costly renovation of Franklin's former home. The Times reported, quote, "Initial estimates are that the bones are about 200 years old and were buried at the time Franklin was living in the house, which was his home from 1757 to 1762 and from 1764 to 1775. Most of the bones show signs of having been dissected, sawn, or cut. One skull has been drilled with several holes," end quote. Later reports from the Benjamin Franklin house revealed that not only were human remains found, but animal remains as well, that appear to be blackened or charred as if by fire and then hidden beneath the floorboards of the home. Needless to say, the evidence has caused a number of researchers to suggest that Franklin's involvement with the Hellfire Club may have been connected with Satanists performing ritual killings of both humans and animals. With that brief history of the men designated to design the Great Seal in mind, it's important to note that besides Benjamin Franklin, as many as 44 of the 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence were also Freemasons. Numerous U.S. presidents were part of the craft as well, including Washington, Monroe, Jackson, Polk, Buchanan, A. Johnson, Garfield, McKinley, Theodore Roosevelt, Taft, Harding, F. Roosevelt, Truman, L.B. Johnson, Ford, and numerous others, not to mention those in the order such as Paul Revere, Edmund Burke, John Hancock, and so many more. Besides the Great Seal, the question, though, of whether the Order of Freemasons engineered the entire United States city named after America's first president, according to an occult grand design, is something that I want to talk about. It's definitely something that a growing body of historians and researchers are admitting. For instance, David Oveson, who became a Mason after writing The Secret Architect of Our Nation's Capital, The Masons and the Building of Washington, D.C., he argues effectively that the city's layout intentionally incorporated the esoteric belief system of Freemasonry, especially as it involved astrologically aligning the capital with the constellation Virgo or Isis. In 1793, when George Washington sanctioned the laying of the Capitol building's cornerstone, he did that while wearing a Masonic apron emblazoned with the Brotherhood's symbols. For occult expert Manly P. Hall, that made perfect sense. Was Francis Bacon's vision of the New Atlantis a prophetic dream of the great civilization which was so certain to rise upon the soil of the New World, he asked in his book, The Secret Teachings of All Ages? It cannot be doubted, he said, that the secret societies conspired to establish such upon the American continent. Hall's New Atlantis reference was based on a utopian scheme that the European secret societies of the 16 and 1700s were literally infatuated with, wherein an occult democracy would be established based on men participating with ancient Greco-Roman gods to earn their favor, their protection, their power in the establishment of a government dedicated to their second coming at the dawn of a new golden age. That's why all of this is on the Great Seal. It's why the city is laid out the way it is. Now, Hall continued that historical incidents in the early development of the United States clearly bore, quote, the influence of that secret body which has so long guided the destinies of people and religions. By them, nations are created as vehicles for the promulgation of ideas. And while nations are true to these ideals, they survive. When they vary from them, they vanish, like the Atlantis of old, which had ceased to know the gods, end quote. Involvement by Freemasons for the development of early America as the New Atlantis is clearly viewed from the Great Seal all the way over to the symbolic layout of Washington, D.C., as the capital for this new Atlantis. And in fact, that's been so well documented over the last few decades that even Masons today have ceased denying the affiliation. And in fact, daily Masonic tours through services devoted to that history are now offered of the city's landmarks to illustrate the connection, literally for a fee. A guide will help you visit locations such as the George Washington Masonic National Memorial or the House of the Temple, the headquarters of the Scottish Rite Freemasonry. The House of the Temple, I've been there numerous times. I've met with 33-degree Freemasons there, asked many, many questions that are in numerous of my books. Designed in 1911, the House of the Temple hosts the Freemason Hall of Fame, an enormous collection of Freemason memorabilia, including various artworks important to the Masons, a library of 250,000 books, which I've gone through, and more importantly is the location for the Rite's Supreme Council 33rd degree meetings. When you leave the building, you can exit the House of the Temple, walk down the street, and take pictures of the enormous Masonic obelisk, the phallic Egyptian symbol of fertility in the distance known as the Washington Monument, which I will discuss here in a few moments. But for obvious reasons, while modern Masons may openly admit these days to involvement by their Jacobite ancestors toward establishing the foundation for a utopian New World Order in Washington, D.C., most vigorously deny that the talisman-like layout of the streets, government buildings, and Masonic monuments were actually meant for what researcher David Bay calls, quote, an electric-type grid that pulsates with luciferic power 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, end quote. Notwithstanding that denial, the government's own records explain otherwise, clearly stating that the capital city design was indeed shepherded by those who wanted it to reflect dedication to the pagan gods. For instance, the article that anybody can Google and read, called The Most Approved Plan, the Competition for the Capitol's Design. You can find that on the Library of Congress's own website. And it tells how, after advertising a competition for the design of Government Center in D.C., George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and the commissioners of the District of Columbia were disappointed by the entries, and a design based on, quote, the Roman Pantheon, the circular domed rotunda dedicated to all pagan gods, was suggested by Jefferson, who later shepherded it through several transformations in order to accomplish the end goal. Now, Freemason David Ovison adds that when the cornerstone of the U.S. Capitol building was laid, it was actually done through Masonic rituals meant to procure approval of these pagan gods. As recorded in 2 bronze panels on the Senate doors of the Capitol, George Washington is seen standing in front of a Mason who holds two versions of the Masonic square, while he himself uses a Masonic trowel on the cornerstone. It is the apron that Washington so famously wore that day that bears specific Masonic symbolism, which Oveson explains as designed to, quote, please the invisible agencies who watched over the event. Undoubtedly, invisible agencies were present at the cornerstone ceremony, he says, but they were made visible in the apron's symbolism, the radiant eye, representing the invisible presence of the great architect, the high spiritual being who had been invited by prayer and ritual to oversee the ceremonial. The radiant eye was the sun eye, or spiritual sun of Horus, Osiris, Apollo. The United States, therefore, cast on the Great Seal and within the layout of the Capitol building, all of this reflects the secret society's scheme to fulfill the Baconian dream of a new Atlantis by establishing America as the capital of the New World Order. Hall continued, quote, here on the Great Seal is represented the Great Pyramid of Giza, composed of 13 rows of masonry, showing 72 stones. The pyramid is without a capstone, and above its upper platform floats a triangle containing the all-seeing eye, surrounded by rays of light. The combination of the pyramid and the all-seeing eye is more than chance or coincidence. There is nothing about the early struggles of the colonists to suggest such a selection of farmers, shoekeepers, and country gentlemen were behind the design. There's only one possible origin for these symbols, and that is the secret societies, which came to this country 150 years before the Revolutionary War. Most of the patriots who achieved American independence belonged to these societies and derived their inspiration, courage, and high purpose from the ancient teachings. There can be no question that the Great Seal was directly inspired by these orders of the human quest, and that it has set forth the purpose for this nation as that purpose was seen and known to the founding fathers. The monogram of the New Atlantis reveals this continent as set apart for the accomplishment of the great work. Here is to arise the pyramid of human aspiration, the school of the secret sciences, end quote. Besides Manly Hall, other late scholars who also recognized the occult symbolism of the Great Seal as pointing to this secret destiny of America included famous people like Rhodes Scholar James H. Billington, Harvard professor Charles Eliot Norton, who described the Great Seal as hardly other than an emblem of a Masonic fraternity. And in 1846, 33rd degree Freemason and noted author James D. Carter inadvertently confirmed that as well when he admitted that the Masonic symbolism is clearly known whenever, quote, an informed Mason examines the Great Seal, end quote. And yet, for all the volumes written in the early years about the arcane meaning behind the symbols and mottos of the Great Seal, it was not until the 1930s that, perhaps by providence, the significance of the seal started finding its defining moment. It happened when two-term President Franklin Delano Roosevelt decided to run for an unprecedented third term, and he chose as his running mate for the vice presidency Secretary of Agriculture and 32nd degree Mason Henry Wallace. Both men were mystically minded 32nd degree Freemasons and saw in the Great Seal what they called a Masonic prophecy of a coming New World Order under an exalted U.S. president. Both men were also devotees of Agni Yogi Society founder and theosophist Nicholas Roerich, who had migrated from the Soviet Union to the United States. And in the 1920s and 30s, he made a name for himself on the New York scene as a teacher of Madame Blavatsky's Theosophical Secret Doctrine. Rorick's particular devotion, however, to mysticism was increasingly focused on apocalyptic themes surrounding the coming of a new earthly order that would be born out of chaos. And that struck a chord with Wallace in particular. All of this came to light later when Henry Wallace began the VP race and was actually threatened by embarrassment from the Republicans who had come into possession of a series of letters written by Wallace in the 1930s. Some of those communications were addressed to Rorick as Dear Guru, and they described the anticipation that Wallace felt for what he called the breaking of the new day, a time when a mythical kingdom would arrive on Earth, accompanied by a special breed of people. Although Roosevelt would be the one to set in motion the push to place the Great Seal of the United States on the U.S. $1 bill, it was Wallace who actually claimed it was he who first brought the seal's oracular significance to Roosevelt in the 1930s, believing that the symbolism of the emblems carried reference to Roosevelt's New Deal, and more important, the Masonic prophecy toward a new world order. Wallace describes this meeting that he had with Roosevelt. Quote, Roosevelt, as he looked at the colored reproduction of the seal, was first struck with the representation of the all-seeing eye, a Masonic representation of the great architect of the universe. Next, he was impressed with the idea that the foundation for the new order of the ages had been laid in 1776, but that it would be completed only under the eye of the great architect. Roosevelt, like myself, was a 32nd degree Mason, and he suggested that the seal be put on the dollar bill. And then he took the matter up with the Secretary of Treasury, who was also a Freemason, and brought it up in a cabinet meeting and asked James Farley, who was the Postmaster General and a Roman Catholic, if he thought the Catholics would have any objection to the all-seeing eye, which he, as a Mason, looked on as a Masonic symbol of deity. And Farley said, no, there would be no objection, end quote. Regardless of who, between Roosevelt and Wallace, first perceived the seal's Masonic prophetic significance, surviving records clearly show that it was Roosevelt, and in his own handwriting no less, who instructed that the front side of the seal be placed on the right back of the dollar, and the reverse side of the seal, with the pyramid and all-seeing eye, be put on the left side, so that it would be the first thing that people saw when reading the back of the dollar bill from left to right. Therefore, most Americans were left with the impression that the mysterious pyramid and its heralding of a new order under the coming of a god were the foremost symbols of the American Republic. Wallace and Roosevelt viewed this all-seeing eye above the unfinished pyramid as pointing to the return or the reincarnation of the coming savior of Masonry, referenced in the mottos Anno et Coeptus and Novus Ordo Seclorum, whose arrival would cap the pyramid and then launch the New World Order. The all-seeing eye on the Great Seal is fashioned after the Eye of Horus, the offspring of Osiris, or Osiris resurrected, as both of these men understood. But Aleister Crowley, who was also a 33rd degree Freemason, who called himself the wickedest man on earth, the Antichrist 666 and all that, he was a Rorick occult contemporary. And he often spoke of this as the new age of Horus being reflected on the Great Seal, and the breaking dawn of the rebirth of Osiris. That such mystics and Freemasons simultaneously used such identical language is telling, given what I pointed out earlier, that the Great Seal's mottos and symbolism relate to both Osiris and Apollo specifically and yet as one. Osiris is the dominant theme of the Egyptian symbols, his resurrection and return, while the mottos of the seal point directly to Apollo, and the eagle, a pagan emblem of Jupiter, to Apollo's father. This prophecy begins in symbolism on the front side of the Great Seal with the symbol of Jupiter, a bald eagle, who clutches a bundle of arrows in his left talon, while its right claw grips an olive branch. Besides the origin of the Latin mottos on the Great Seal being derived from Apollonian prophecies forecasting the second coming of this Apollo Osiris under the usurper Jupiter-Saturn in a final occult world order, the symbols on the Great Seal confirm the secret destiny of America and the desire of especially Thomas Jefferson to accommodate the magical entry of these entities at the start of what I would call the Great Tribulation period. And again, I've gone out on a limb, and I am pointing to the year 2025 as potentially the start date of that event. When you look at the front side of the Great Seal, you're stricken with the redundancy of the number 13's uses. 13 bars and stripes in the shield, 13 arrows, 13 leaves in the olive branch, and so on. Now that pattern continues on the reverse side with 13 levels in the uncapped pyramid, 13 letters of Anahuac Coeptus, and so on. Albert Pike, in his famous book Morals and Dogma, revealed that Freemasonry's two sets of meanings exist behind these symbols. In this case, the superficial translation for Blue Degree Masons and the profane, that's you and me, which assert that the number 13 refers to the original 13 colonies or states. However, what Pike also revealed is that the deeper meaning, understood by 33rd degree Masonry, is that the mystical number 13 actually reflects those parts of Osiris that Isis was able to find after he was murdered by his evil brother Set. I'll talk more about that in a moment. The same is true with the phrase in the banner E pluribus unum, which is Latin for out of many, one, which laity and 32nd lower blue masonry degrees are told refers to the many ethnicities that came together to form one nation, while high degree occultists acknowledge that the true meaning of E pluribus unum echoes the God of many names, Gilgamesh, Osiris, Apollo, Nimrod, as the singular entity prophesied on the Great Seal to rule the world at the end of time. That's clearly understood whenever high-degree occultists and master Freemasons observe the bald eagle, the ancient icon of the god Jupiter, whose prophesied return is captioned in the phrase Anahuac Coeptus on the reverse side of the seal, with the 13 stars forming a hexagram above his head. For example, 33rd degree Freemason and occultist Aleister Crowley, who claimed that the incorporeal entity Awas elected him to be the prophet that would lead the world into the age of Horus, the second coming of Osiris Apollo. He employed the same symbols of an eagle and a hexagram above its head as a talisman to summon the second coming of Jupiter. And then there's the accompanying layout of Washington, D.C. itself. David Oveson, who I mentioned earlier, whose works have been widely endorsed by Freemasons, including the top-level Freemasons in Washington, D.C., and also endorsed by Robert Hieronymus, considered one of the world's foremost authorities on the Great Seal. His works have been called, quote, exceptionally well referenced, and adds that the dedication of buildings such as the U.S. Capitol building, Cornerstone, had to be done at certain astrological times related to the zodiacal constellation Virgo or Isis, while Jupiter was rising in Scorpio because, quote, the Cornerstone ceremonial was designed not only to gain the approval of the spiritual beings, but also had to ensure that these were content that the building was being brought into the world at the right time, end quote. Oveson later stated more directly, quote, whoever arranged for Virgo to be so consistently operative during foundation and cornerstone ceremonies must have been alert to the fact that they were inviting some archetype or spiritual being to direct the destiny of the city, end quote. Finally, Oveson hints who the spiritual being governing the capital of the United States and directing our destiny is when he said, quote, "A medieval esotericist would have said that Washington, D.C. was governed by the intelligency Hamalel, the spiritual entity which ruled Virgo and which worked hand in hand with Mercury," end quote. Hamalel, folks, is an evil adversary of the cherubim of God, serving under Lilith, whose devotees gather annually with U.S. presidents and other global dignitary to honor her at the Bohemian Grove. As a result of this alignment of the Capitol buildings and streets in Washington, D.C. with this constellation, every August 10, an astrological event reoccurs in the sky above Washington, tying the city to the pagan Virgo, known in ancient Egypt as the goddess Isis. Quote, "At dusk, as golden light turns brick facades a dusty rose, the shimmering sun floats a few degrees just to the left of Pennsylvania Avenue, gradually including to the right until it sets directly over the famous street," says Julie Duen. If the horizon remains cloudless, 3 stars are visible in a straight line from the Capitol of the White House to the skies in the west, known as Regulus, Arcturus, and Spica. The stars form a right-angled triangle, framing the constellation of Virgo, end quote. Folks, such mysticism, incorporated into the design of Washington, D.C. by Freemasons for summoning the timing, presence, and approval of these invisible agents, was a formula actually perfected in pagan Rome, the gods of whom Thomas Jefferson insisted Washington, D.C. be in dedication to. John Fellows explains why this is true. Quote, "They consulted the gods to know if the enterprise would be acceptable to them, and if they approved of the day chosen to begin the work. They invoked, besides the gods of the country, the gods to whose protection the new city was recommending, which was done secretly because it was necessary that the tutelary gods should be unknown to the vulgar." It may come as little surprise then that when George W. Bush, in a speech the day before his second inaugural, said that the United States had, quote, "a calling from beyond the stars," end quote, which is, by the way, a disturbing statement taken directly from the satanic Necronomicon fiction concerning alien creator gods, that the Capitol building had been intentionally set in the head of a Masonic owl figure, which in turn stands atop the White House, located on the chin of the pentagrammic goat of Mendes. The upside-down pentagram, or Baphomet, clearly visible in the D.C. street layout, represents the goat's head, and it's considered the most powerful symbol in Satanism, while the owl figure is a well-known representative of the Masonic, Illuminati, Bohemian, Owl of Wisdom incarnation of Athena, Minerva, Lilith, and Hecate. Occultists around the world understand the power of these DC symbols and rituals, and they realize that they are not only for conveying psychological concepts, but are there actually to coerce the mysterious and potent supernaturalism invited to take residence there. That is a belief system that is deeply preserved in all of the mystery school, Masonic, Babylonian, Egyptian, Greek, Roman, Kabbalistic symbolism that is and remains a part of modern Masonic history. According to famous Freemason Foster Bailey, those symbols intentionally hide, quote, "a secret which veils mysterious forces. These energies, when released, can have a potent effect," end quote. Scottish philosopher Thomas Carlyle once famously added, quote, "By symbols, accordingly, is man guided and commanded, made happy, made wretched," end quote. As previously pointed out, Masons are, as a result, under oath, never to reveal the true meaning of their symbols, and when somehow they are compelled to offer explanation, they falsify the statement, even to lower degree Masons. Substantial reasons exist for why the designers of Washington's Government Center would have wanted to likewise obscure the meaning behind the occultic layout of America's capital. If the public in general had been prematurely convinced of the end game prophesied in the DC symbolism, it would have been beyond the acceptance of prior generations, who likely would have demanded change in leaders and facilities. But as time moved forward, and increasingly it has become necessary for public understanding of America's heritage and secret destiny and intended purpose, little by little, either by providence, promotion, or even resistance, a clearer picture has emerged of what Manly P. Hall called the secret destiny of America. Now, as I've written in several books, the vast majority of people, when looking at Washington, D.C., and at the Vatican, never comprehend how these cities actually constitute one of the greatest open conspiracies of all time. In both cities, reproduced in all their glory and right before the world's eyes, is an ancient talismanic diagram based on the history and the cult of Isis, Osiris, and Horus, including the magical utilities meant to generate the deity's return. It's a primeval concept, especially that of domes facing obelisk. This was designed in antiquity for the express purpose of regeneration, resurrection, and apotheosis, for deity incarnation from the underworld to the earth's surface, through union of the respective figures, the dome, which is the ancient structural representation of the womb of Isis, and the obelisk, which is the ancient representation of the erect male phallus of Osiris. That layout, as modeled in antiquity, exists today on the grandest scale at the heart of the capital of the most powerful government on earth, the United States, as well as in the heart of the most politically influential church on earth, the Vatican. Now, given this fact and the pattern provided by the Apostle Paul and the Apocalypse of John, the book of Revelation, that the end times would culminate in a marriage between political, that is Antichrist, and religious, that is false prophet, authorities at the return of Osiris Apollo, it behooves open-minded researchers to carefully consider these prophecies in stone, as it defines the spiritual energy that's knowingly or unknowingly being invoked at both locations, with potential ramifications for the year 2025 and beyond. The U.S. Capitol has been called the Mirror Vatican due to the strikingly similar layout and design of its primary buildings and streets. And that's no accident. In fact, America's forefathers first named the capital city Rome. But the parallelism between Washington and the Vatican is most clearly illustrated by the Capitol building and dome facing the obelisk known as the Washington Monument, and at St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican by a similar dome facing a familiar obelisk, both of which were, according to their own official records, fashioned after the Roman Pantheon, the circular domed rotunda dedicated to all pagan gods. That layout, a domed temple facing an obelisk, is an ancient alchemical blueprint that holds significant esoteric meaning. And for those that may not know, the U.S. Capitol building in Washington, D.C. is historically based on a pagan Masonic temple. Thomas Jefferson, who shepherded the anti-Christian Roman Pantheon design, wrote to the Capitol's architect Benjamin Latrobe, defining it as, quote, the first temple, dedicated to embellishing with Athenian taste the course of a nation looking far beyond the range of Athenian destinies, end quote. The Athenian Empire was first known as Osiria, the kingdom of Osiris. Now, in 1833, Massachusetts Representative Rufus Coyote agreed with that, writing, quote, we have built no national temples but the Capitol, end quote. William Henry and Mark Gray in their secular research book, Freedom's Gate, Lost Symbols in the U.S. Capitol, add that, quote, the U.S. Capitol has numerous architectural and other features that unquestionably identify it with ancient temples. After listing features to make their case that the U.S. Capitol building is a religious temple, including housing the images of a deified being, heavenly beings, God, symbols, inscriptions, sacred geometry, columns, prayers, orientation to the sun, and so on. They then concluded, quote, the designers of the city of Washington, D.C. oriented it to the sun, especially the rising sun on June 21 and December 21. By the way, the dates in 2020, the Newsweek and other sources reported the Aztec calendar stone in the Capitol Rotunda rolled over to a final age, follow December 21, 2020 by the alignment of Jupiter and Saturn, heralding the arrival of a promised sun that we mentioned earlier. But all that aside, the measurements for this orientation were made from the location of the center of the dome of the U.S. Capitol, rendering it a solar temple. Its alignment and encoded numerology point to the sun as well as to the stars. A golden circle on the rotunda story and a white star in the crypt marks the spot. It is clear that the builders viewed the Capitol as America's sole temple, a solemn solar temple, to be exact, end quote. Now, to understand what those statements may soon mean for the future of the world, one needs to comprehend how these apparati, the dome and the obelisk facing it, actually facilitate important archaic and modern protocols for invigorating prophetic supernatural alchemy. In ancient times, the obelisk represented the god Osiris's missing male organ, which Isis was not able to find after her husband brother was slain and chopped into 14 pieces by his evil brother Seth or Set. The story involves a detailed account of the envious brother Set working with 72 conspirators to trick Osiris into climbing into a box, which Set locked and threw into the Nile. Osiris drowned, and his body floated down the Nile River where it snagged on the limbs of a tamarisk tree. In Byblos, Isis recovered his body from the riverbank and took it into her care, but in her absence, Set stole the body again, and this time he chopped it into 14 pieces, which he threw into the Nile. Isis searched the riverbank until she recovered every piece except for the genitals, which had been swallowed by a fish. Isis recombined the 13 pieces of Osiris that she had found and replaced his missing organ with a magic facsimile, an obelisk, which she then used to impregnate herself during the very first raising of Osiris ceremony, in which she called forth the seed of the dead god from the underworld up through the magic device, thus giving rise to Osiris again in the person of his son, Horus. That legend for reincarnating Osiris literally formed the core of Egyptian cosmology, as well as the Rosicrucian Masonic dying and rising myths, and was fantastically venerated on the most imposing scale throughout all of Egypt by towering obelisks representing the phallus of Osiris and domes representing the pregnant belly of Isis, including at Karnak, where the upright obelisks were vitalized or stimulated from the energy of the masturbatory sun god Ra shining down upon them. Now, in Egypt, where these rituals were performed and perfected to actually raise the spirit of Osiris into the reigning pharaoh, political authority in the form of divine kingship or theocratic statesmanship was established, later reflected in the political and religious doctrine of the divine right of kings, who supposedly derived their rights to rule from the will of God, with the exception that in some countries the king is subject to the church, aka the Pope. But this meant, among other things, that the Egyptian pharaoh enjoyed extraordinary authority as the son of the sun god Ra and the incarnation of the falcon god Horus during his lifetime. Now at death, Pharaoh would become the Osiris, the divine judge of the netherworld, and on earth his son and predecessor would take his place as the newly anointed manifestation of Horus, or the reincarnated seed of Osiris. So each generation of pharaohs provided the gods with a spokesman for the present world and for the afterlife, while also offering the nation divinely appointed leadership. The observant listener at this point may be wondering, but was there something more to the pharaoh's deification than faith in ritual magic? The cult center of Amun-Ra at Thebes may actually hold the answer, as it was the site of the largest religious structure ever built, the Temple of Amun-Ra at Karnak, and the location of many extraordinary, mysterious rites. The great temple, with its miles of walls and gardens, was the primary object of fascination, by the way, and worship by the nemesis of Moses, the pharaoh of the Exodus, Ramses II. But this was the place where each pharaoh would reconcile his divinity in the company of Amun-Ra during a festival called Opet. The festival was held at the Temple of Luxor, and it included a procession of gods carried on barges up the Nile River from Karnak to the temple. The royal family would accompany the gods on boats, while the Egyptian laity would walk along the shore, calling aloud and making requests of the gods, and even acting out parts of the ritual and mythology of the Osiris-Isis myth. But once they arrived at Luxor, the pharaoh and his entourage would enter the Holy of Holies, where the ceremony to raise the spirit of Osiris into the king would be performed, and Pharaoh would be transmogrified into a living deity. So as he's standing inside the domed belly of Isis, looking out into the courtyard at the obelisk of Osiris, these Egyptian magicians, which according to the Exodus were very, very powerful, they could mimic almost all of the miracles that Moses performed at the command of God, they would conduct the raising of Osiris ceremony. So the seed of Osiris would be drawn up from out of the underworld through the obelisk in the courtyard, magically emit into the domed belly of Isis where Pharaoh was standing, and that's when he would be changed in that moment. He went in to the dome a man, he walks outside, he is a god. And there he greets a large group of dancers and musicians who had been waiting anxiously. He was born again, Osiris, and the crowd would erupt in gaiety. And from that day forward, the pharaoh would be considered to be, just as the god ciphered on the Great Seal of the United States will be, the son and spiritual incarnation of the supreme deity. The all-seeing eye of Horus, Apollo, Osiris above the unfinished pyramid on the Great Seal represents that actual event. Fast forward to today. At the inauguration of every American president, while he is standing inside the U.S. Capitol dome, looking out at the largest obelisk of its kind in the world, across town at the House of the Temple, the modern Egyptian magicians, the Freemasons, simultaneously are conducting the raising of Osiris ceremony to call forth the seed of Osiris Apollo from the underworld through the Washington Monument obelisk, where it magically emits into the U.S. Capitol dome, where America's new leader is standing there, accepting his role as the living representative of deity. Now, this is being done in anticipation of the day when events are going to surpass parity, and the beast that was and is not shall ascend out of the bottomless pit and go into perdition, Apollo. And they that dwell on earth shall wonder, whose names were not written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, when they behold the beast that was and is not and yet is. For a few adepts of history and secret orders, the DC ritual is deliciously staged, as even the term inaugurate is from the Latin or Roman inauguratio and refers to the archaic ceremony by which the Roman augurs or soothsayers would approve a king or a ruler or other action through omens as being sanctioned by the god Jupiter, which Thomas Jefferson wanted America dedicated to, the same entity whose prophecies on the Great Seal herald his upcoming challenge to Yahweh Jehovah for heavenly supremacy, while his son, for a while, Apollo Osiris, seizes authority over the world in a final golden pagan age. As pointed out in our best-selling documentary Belly of the Beast and in broadcast programs on Skywatch TV, the dome where U.S. presidents stand during inauguration and where they lie in state for their spirit to rise into the apotheosis overhead to join George Washington in the kingdom of Osiris at death, alone is an unparalleled magical construct that openly hides the most formidable ancient supernaturalism meant for regeneration of Apollo Osiris. In fact, the U.S. Capitol Dome is a satanic antichrist plagiarism of the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ that I believe is going to play a role in the healing of Antichrist after he experiences a deadly head wound in Revelation 13:3. Note that the 1865 Apotheosis of Washington, which was painted by Greek-Italian artist Constantino Brumidi, is visible through the oculus of the dome and the rotunda. It bears anything but Christian symbols. It is filled with those Greco-Roman gods to whom Thomas Jefferson dedicated the United States. It is called the Apotheosis of Washington. Apotheosis means to become a god or a revived eternal being. In this depiction, Washington is becoming Osiris of the afterlife. The gods in the painting surrounding Washington are depicted helping the founders establish a more perfect union, as in the New Atlantis scheme described elsewhere in my upcoming book, Zeitgeist 2025. Directly beneath the apotheosis are 72 pentagrams forming a sorcerous gateway used by secret society members and occultists to bind and loose the 72 fallen angels that are over the heathen nations. You can learn about that in Psalms 82, Deuteronomy 32, and other research on the Divine Council. Finally, under that is the floor of the rotunda. And beneath the floor of the rotunda is what is called the U.S. National Crypt, where, yes, an empty tomb resides. He is not there, for he is risen. And this is the very location where I argue Antichrist is going to be taken after his head injury, and the Freemasons will conduct the raising of Osiris ceremony, at which time he's going to be transformed into the living incarnation of Osiris, Apollo. Now, there's a lot more to the Capitol Dome Antichrist plagiarism of the life of Christ in those aspects of the building's design. And for a limited time, we're going to be giving away the Belly of the Beast documentary and other special productions that lay all of this hidden architecture and symbolism out. We're going to be giving that away free with the new book, Zeitgeist 2025, in the Skywatch TV store. But the points of interest clearly reveal how the architects of the U.S. Capitol Dome imagined a dark parody of Jesus, because as Jesus died and rose into heaven, so Washington rises into a heaven to become the Osiris. As the 72 pentagrams in the Capitol Dome are used to control the 72 cosmo craters over the nations, Jesus confronted the 72 fallen watchers from the base of Mount Hermon to his visit in the underworld and final ascension into heaven, whereby he proclaimed in Revelation 1:18, I am he that liveth and was dead, and behold, I am alive forevermore, which is a clear denunciation of the Osiris dying and rising myth that was so popular during the first advent of Jesus. A man and have the keys of hell, he goes on to say, but he uses there the Greek word Hades, which is the Greek name for Osiris. So think about what's happening there. He says, I am he who was dead and am alive forevermore. I'm the true dying and rising God. And I'm the one who has the keys of hell, Hades, and death. That's important because Osiris at the time of Christ was considered the lord of the underworld in Greek myth, and he controlled who possessed the keys to the 12 gates of the Egyptian afterlife. Much has been written by historians within and without Masonry as to the relevance of the number 72 and the alchemy related to it. In the Kabbalah, Freemasonry, and Jewish apocalyptic writings, for instance, 72 equals the total of wings that Enoch received when he was transformed into the powerful angel Metatron. Now that plays an important role for the Brotherhood, for Masonry, because Metatron is the one that was enabled as the guiding spirit over America during the reign of George W. Bush, whose family, by the way, have contributed millions of dollars to advancing the rights of Scottish Rite Freemasonry. And that's acknowledged inside the Hall of Charity within the Herodome where I've been. Bush's administration enabled the angel in the whirlwind, Metatron, to direct the future and fate of the United States, as also was prayed by Congressman Major R. Owens of New York before the House of Representatives on Wednesday, February 28, 2001. But in the context of the Capitol Dome and the 72 stars that encircle Washington's apotheosis in the womb of Isis, the significance of that symbolism is far more important. In sacred literature, including the Bible, stars are symbolic of angels, and within Masonic Gnosticism, these 72 powerful entities reflected in the 72 conspirators that controlled Osiris's life in Egyptian myth, they currently administer the affairs of earth under Satan, the god of this world, according to 2 Corinthians 4:4. Experts in the study of the divine council believe that, beginning at the Tower of Babel, the world and its inhabitants were disinherited by the sovereign God of Israel and placed under the authority of 72 angels, which became corrupt and disloyal to God in their administration of those nations, Psalms 82. Those beings quickly became worshipped on earth as gods following Babel, led by none other than Nimrod, Gilgamesh, Osiris, Apollo. Consistent within that tradition, the designers of the Capitol Dome, the Great Seal of the United States, and the obelisk, Washington Monument, circled the apotheosis of Washington with 72 pentagram stars. They dedicated the obelisk 72 years after the signing of the Declaration of Independence, and they placed 72 stones on the Great Seal's uncapped pyramid, above which the eyes of Horus, Osiris, Apollo stare from the Great Seal of the United States. Those three sets of 72, combined with the imagery and occult numerology of the Osiris obelisk and the Isis dome and the oracular Great Seal, are symbolic of the influence of Satan, a demonic trinity, and his angels over the world, with a prophecy toward Satan's final earthly empire, the coming Novus Ordo Seclorum, or the New Golden Pagan Age. In order for the inevitable worship of Osiris to be reestablished on earth, these 72 demons that govern the nations have to be controlled. Therefore, they're set in magical constraints on the Great Seal, the Washington obelisk, and the pentagram circles around the apotheosis of Washington in order to bind and force the occultist's desired effect. In The Secret Destiny of America, Hall noted as well that the 72 stones of the pyramid on the Great Seal correspond to the 72 arrangements of the Tetragrammaton, or the four-lettered name of God in Hebrew. He said, quote, "These four letters can be combined in 72 combinations, resulting in what is called the Shem HaMephorash, which represents in turn the laws, powers, and energies of nature," end quote. Now the idea that the mystical name of God could be invoked by occultists to bind or loose supernatural agents, or powers and energies of nature, as Hall called them, is meaningful creed within many occult tenets, including Kabbalah and Freemasonry. And this is why the 72 stars are pentagram-shaped around the deified Freemason George Washington. Medieval books of magic, or grimoires, such as the Key of Solomon and the Lesser Key of Solomon, not only identify the star systems Orion, which is Osiris, and Pleiades, which is Apollo, as the home of these powers, but applies great importance to the pentagram shape of the stars for binding and loosing their influence. Adept Rosicrucians and Freemasons have been using these magical texts forever, the Key of Solomon and the Lesser Key of Solomon, to do just that. Modern people, especially in America, might view the architecture used in this magic, the dome representing the habitually pregnant belly of Isis, and the obelisk representing the erect phallus of Osiris, as profane or pornographic. But in fact, to the occultists, these are ritualized fertility objects, which they and the ancients believed could produce tangible reactions, properties, or manifestations within the material world. The obelisk and dome, as imitations of the deity's male and female reproductive organs, could, through government representation, invoke into existence the being or beings symbolized by them. So, through such imitative sex, the dome and obelisk become energy receivers capable of assimilating Ra's essence from the rays of the sun, which in turn draw forth the seed of the underworld Osiris. The seed of the dead deity would, according to the supernaturalism, transmit upward out of the underworld through the base or testes of the obelisk, and magically emit from the tower's head into the womb or dome of Isis, where incarnation into the sitting pharaoh or king or president would occur during what Freemasons also call the raising of Osiris ceremony. And in that way, Osiris could be habitually born again, reincarnated as Horus, and constantly direct the spiritual destiny of the nation. Now, let me get to the main point of all of this. Because the book of Revelation depicts a final global political figure called Antichrist, who gains allegiance of the world's religious community through a powerful religious leader called the false prophet, it's not surprising to find that the magical constructs in Washington, D.C., necessary for Apollo-Osiris resurrection are mirrored in the very city where the Apostle John said a global harlot church would lead mankind into subservience to the man of sin, something many conservative Catholics for hundreds and hundreds of years have also believed and written about. Now, to be sure, the 330-ton obelisk in St. Peter's Square in the Vatican City is not just any obelisk. It was actually cut from a single block of red granite during the 5th dynasty of Egypt to stand as Osiris's erect phallus at the Temple of the Sun in ancient Heliopolis, or the city of On, as it is called in the Bible, dedicated to Ra, Osiris, and Isis. The obelisk was moved from Heliopolis to the Julian Forum of Alexandria by Emperor Augustus, and later from there by Caligula to Rome to stand at the spine of the Circus, where, under Nero, its excited presence maintained a counter-vigil over countless brutal Christian executions, including the martyrdom of the Apostle Peter, according to some historians. Over 1,500 years following that, Pope Sixtus V ordered hundreds of workmen under celebrated engineer architects Giovanni and Domenico Fontana to move the phallic pillar to the center of St. Peter's Square in Rome. Now, when the cross was placed on top of the obelisk, as you see it today, in the middle of St. Peter's Square, the Pope marked that occasion by conducting the ancient rite of exorcism against the phallic symbol. This was first scheduled to occur September 14th to coincide with the liturgical feast of the Exaltation of the Cross, and not coincidentally under the zodiacal sign of Virgo, Isis. But the event was delayed until later in the month and fell under the sign of Libra, representing a zenith event for the year. On that morning, a pontifical high mass was held just before the cross was raised from a portable altar to the apex of Baal's shaft, as such phallic towers were also known. While clergy prayed and a choir sang psalms, Pope Sixtus stood facing the obelisk and extending his hand towards it, announced in Latin, "I exorcise you, creature of stone, in the name of God." Sixtus then cast sanctified water upon the pillar's middle, then its right side, then left, then above, and finally below, to form a cross, followed by, "In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost, Amen." He then crossed himself 3 times and watched as the symbol of Christ was placed atop Osiris's erect phallus. Now, upon strolling from the obelisk in St. Peter's Square to inside the Sistine Chapel, one finds the parallels between Washington and the prophecies of the Great Seal do not stop with the dome design and symbol of Osiris's erect manhood, but the very Cumae Sibyl, whose prophecy about the return of the god Apollo is encoded in the Great Seal of the United States, is prominently depicted inside Catholicism's most celebrated chapel. With all of that in mind, whatever happens between now and 2025, I firmly believe events unfolding around the world today, and especially inside the United States, suggest a very near future in which a man of superior intelligence, wit, charm, and diplomacy is indeed going to emerge on the world scene as a savior. He will seemingly possess transcendent wisdom that enables him to solve problems and to offer solutions for too many of today's most perplexing issues. His popularity is going to be widespread. His fans are going to include the young and old, religious and non-religious, male and female. Talk show hosts are going to be interviewing his colleagues. News anchors will be covering his movements. Scholars will be applauding his uncanny ability at resolving what has escaped the rest of us. And the poor will bow down at his table. He is going in all human respects to appeal to the best ideas of society, but his profound comprehension and irresistible presence will be the manifest of an invisible network of thousands of years of collective knowledge. He will quite literally represent the embodiment of that very old super intelligent spirit predicted on the Great Seal in the capital city layout of the United States. As Jesus Christ was the seed of the woman according to Genesis 3:15, this man's going to be the seed of the serpent. Moreover, though his arrival in the form of a man was foretold by numerous scriptures, the broad masses are not going to immediately recognize him for what he actually is: paganism's ultimate incarnation, the beast, Apollo, Osiris of Revelation 13:1 and 17:8. And so I have to ask you something. Are you therefore prepared spiritually, mentally, and physically for what is just ahead? Ancient and modern occultists obviously have plans for the near future, including strategies to install the dreaded man of sin who will, for a short period of time, conquer and then betray the human race. Thankfully, it's the true Father of heaven and his Son, Jesus Christ, that are going to have the final word and ultimately determine the fate of mankind. Therefore, knowing Jesus as Savior is the first, most important emergency planning step you can take for your future security and survival. With Christ as your Lord, you'll be able to enter thou into thy chambers and shut thy doors about thee and hide thyself, as it were, for a little moment, until the indignation be overpast, according to Isaiah 26:20.